be very, very clear. You know, my knowledge is based on us being practicing architects, right? That's slightly different from coming from the absolute academic corner of the world. So a lot of the things we do when we look for things that could actually inspire us or move us forward is about looking for things that would collectively put us into a situation where we can use the things we read. We can translate the things that we see, and we can bring them into a context like when we get inspired by a small cabin, for instance, in Skjolden in Norway. So this is a very subjective interpretation of things that I'm coming with. I'll be showing you a lot of our own projects to try to put them into context. And nothing, what I'm saying here today, can be taken for granted as such. It really is subjective, and it might not even be transferable to other means of creative work. And I have to also be clear, I have deliberately gone away from doing any reflections on aesthetics and ethics. Now, you might have expected that from me, but in this particular case, I think that is open for discussions at a later stage. So as suggested by Jane Mustard and Peter Wood of Wellington, you might know them, they've been writing some few things about architecture, and Wittgenstein, they're from New Zealand. They say that probably when designing the Stormborough-Wittgenstein house, led Wittgenstein to see the inseparable relationship between linguistics and space. And I would add that in this continuation of thinking about linguistics and space, this also includes landscapes and nature. Now, they actually conclude by stating, it could even perhaps be that during his work on this house is where Wittgenstein's philosophy are the limits of, or being described by the limits of architecture. You could go deep into this kind of a meeting point between when you have to create a house and you have to relate it back to what you have been writing. But that empty space of sketching words in relationship to creating space, to me, is one of the most interesting aspects of the interpretation of Wittgenstein. So that's why, before I move any further into this, I have to explain you a little bit about the background of Snøhetta, because even though there are elements here that are not directly related to how we interpret, for instance, Wittgenstein or other philosophers, but there might be a genuine humanistic aspect to this that could actually improve the relationship of how we read things and how we take them up, how they have been portrayed throughout history. So, in 1987, the Gro Harlem Brundtland report came out. It was the first UN report on sustainability, social, environmental, and economic sustainability. It was called Our Common Future. And in this relationship, we said it must be possible, and this was the first time we took a political document that was very precise and tried to translate it into physical space and design. Is it possible to take a text that you read at this particular point and translate it into the factual ways of designing? Of course, the name Snøhetta is a mountain in Norway, not the tallest, but the most beautiful. And it could be said that by creating this kind of transdisciplinary aspect of things growing together, almost in a Bauhaus manner, is about getting landscape, architecture, design into one piece, even art at that particular point in time. So we work with our people, and our people are the ones interpreting whatever they bring to the table, including people who have read a lot more Wittgenstein than I have in our practice. And you have to be quite aware of how these interpretations are happening when we collectively try to design. So every second year, we walk to the top of the mountain of Snøhetta, together with all the people from around the world, and we sketch out the next 2 years. This is from one of these trips last year. Just to tell you that the next topic I'm going to talk about, of course, relates very much to this. Because what is retraction in landscapes, and what is the collective act of moving forward? So my first interpretation will be on how we as humans relate to the way we read space. You might know this building. It's by Alvar Aalto in Paris. It's the Carré building, 1953. And we were given the task to try to read the space between the building and the edge of the forest. So how do you read this space? By interpreting Alvar Aalto. Of course, there is always something that you can pull out of the visual. There's always something that relates you back to either the empty space or the space in between. And in this sense, of course, the body can describe the same kind of situation, simply by distributing the people in a certain manner, in a certain space, with themselves in there. So that leads me to my first study on certain things, namely the topic walking. It is quite exceptional to be able to transfer yourself into something that is related directly to your surroundings. And normally you would use the things you're not in control of to describe what that sense should be. So walking is, of course, the most incredible thing that we can do, simply because we're up on two. My grandfather convinced me already at early age that when walking in more challenging terrain, you would look down at your feet in order not to stumble. You would look forward to know and understand the route ahead. You would look up to the sky to be able to dream. And sometimes you would look back to see where you came from, to see the distance that you had actually walked. This continuous changing of your eye and the views while walking is then more than just promenading. So the promenading itself is a cultural event rather than the hiking in landscapes. And I have found, for my sake, that most of the landscapes I walk are far rougher than the sidewalks in a city like Vienna. But this is even taken much further. I don't know if you remember Laurie Anderson and her relationship to walking and falling, because she wrote and performed these words, with each step you fall forward slightly, which means basically you do. And then catch yourself from falling. Over and over, again you're falling. And then catching yourself from falling. And this is how you can be walking and falling at the same time. So to walk is something much larger than a list of advantages you can read in an ad for vitamins. Why do we walk? Where do we walk from, and what is our destination? We all have our own answers. Even if you and I walk next to each other, we can experience the walk differently. That's a quote by an author called Erling Kagge, and he was one of the first ones going to the North Pole on his own. Wittgenstein described his walking as both a solitary in his thoughts, and solicitous in his social relations, with his walk sometimes being an end in themselves. So the walking, the road, was the means and the end at the same time. I still, however, believe that he needed a place to come to, because the comfort on the move and the walking itself, together with people or on your own, is at some point going to end. And when they end, you need a place to go to. And this, I think, is important. The next one I'm going to go through very briefly is on the oblique. You might know that the description of Paul Virilio in the 60s, although very, very different from Wittgenstein's way of thinking and describing philosophical approaches, there might be some similarities in the way they look at abstraction, limiting human experiences and perception. You could easily say that there is no such thing as architectural abstraction. You could say that architecture can, when it's built, never ever be an abstraction. It is, in a way, the perception of a possible new reality. And that, of course, gives us the possibility to look at how this collaboration between Paul Virilio and Claude Perrin created this relationship to the oblique. What is the sloping surface doing? Gravity and distribution of vertical aspects related to the landscape you're walking, and your body weight was intended to sensitize you as a person in relationship to your surroundings. The body's physical experience of movement, effort, and balance through the use of slopes, ramps, and reliefs. This, again, led to the redefinition of architectural typologies, because it was directly related to the movement of the body, how do you walk, and it was related to the surfaces you actually walk on. The next one is on prepositions. And you all have read probably much more than I have on the debates and discussions on prepositions in Wittgenstein's work, but they are not, in the way we read it, a set kind of rules. Because here, the Hatshepsut temple in Luxor, in Egypt, is already trying to describe a way of connecting more than the horizontal with its own way of being. This temple embodies densified landscape through the transition of levels. And that, again, tells us, like I just said, that these prepositions don't relate directly to a set of rules. They are intimately connected to human activities and forms of life, meaning that to understand their meaning, one must look at how they are used in practice. That means I can't, and this is Wittgenstein's way of looking at it, you cannot be independently describing where your body is unless it's related to practice. So, he did, however, change his view on prepositions during time. You know, in the early works of the Tractatus, he was more looking at the prepositions in the language as something that was blocking the kind of freedom you would have in relationship to your surroundings. Whereas in the investigations, he aligned them to their specific language games, and claiming at that particular point in time they are not part of an absolute structure. And we have accordingly been debating for a long time the prepositions in architecture for the past, let's say, a decade, Patrick, I would say, last 15 years maybe. We've been debating the we and the I in relationship to the prepositions and the location in praxis. What is the relationship, immediate relationship that you have? The location of your body in relationship to your surroundings. The ownership that is generated by people sitting in their chairs when they come back after a break. We just had a discussion when we came in. I find it extraordinarily beautiful that when you sit on a chair, that chair belongs to you. Once everyone move out, it goes back to the belonging of the Wittgenstein initiative. It is, in a way, natural that the more intimate we are with our immediate surroundings, the more ownership to that particular object can be generated. So, this is transcending many ways of how to look at things. The prepositions, the oblique, the walking, are all inspirational elements that can be brought together, similar to Wittgenstein's understanding of standing of shoulders of giants. Being able to pull together the information that you're getting from so many places, sketching it out, and not being shy, saying so. So I think we, as performing architects, are also nothing but continuously reinventing the things around us. We don't invent, we reinvent, because what we're doing at all times is exactly how things can be related to each other. And this is how these objects that we create can all of a sudden be set in a different setting. The transcendence of an object with the transcendence of the human movement, either being through walking, being through the oblique, or being through the prepositions and the location of the body. And these are small points that we just pull out of different theories and try to put them together in what we do, like with the Library of Alexandria, where the building itself transcends, but also the movement on the inside is a transcendental movement where people are walking from above the ground to below the ground. And by doing that, of course, you generate a certain aspect of dialogue, which is coming not out of necessarily the interior being read through the exterior, as we will see, but maybe just as much a way of explaining the object in its immediate setting. Of course, the art then transcends another step forward, and how you actually use the art, not necessarily as a way of creating the ornament per se, but with the content of the ornament being pushed into the library, where you open a new quarry, like we did at the border of Aswan, border of Sudan in Aswan, how that wall then becomes a collection of languages from all over the world, and how local stonemasons are being trained by us to actually carve and hand carve these signs and symbols for such a library. Now you could say this message that then the library portrays is that wherever you come from in the world, you find something that you can understand, but not as a full sentence, only as a sign. And of course, the section is clear, and it gathers all the people around, from young to old, And like in many of these places, the understanding of the furniture starts becoming essential. Because how do you create, for instance, a piece of furniture that is supposed to be moved around in a building? So those are the movable parts, whereas the book stacks are not. How do you relate to the families that actually take care of the olive trees that you're going to use later? How do you develop the papyrus in order for you to understand how it grows, and then making sure that the perception of all papyrus can be maintained over a longer period of time? What does it all lead to? It leads to the collective ownership of an object, which then is being protected by the inhabitants of Alexandria during the spring. I think we can see some of your buildings along the coastline there.
عندي 16 سنة. أنا باجي المكتبة هنا من وأنا عندي 6 سنين. جيت كونت صداقات من وأنا صغير وكونت عيلة وعندي أصحاب كتير في المكتبة. زي ما تقول كده ممكن في ضغوطات بنتعرض ليها بره. عارف الثيرابي؟ هي المكتبة بالنسبة لي ثيرابي أو فري ثيرابي.
It has opened me to different perspectives and different cultures. I've attended operas here, I've attended theater. I wasn't really into opera or classic productions, but I grew fond to these. I grew fonder to Shakespeare, and I just fell in love with opera. It opened gates that I didn't think was possible for me.
This is independent of scale. Experiences in this relationship are totally independent of scale. This is an underwater restaurant in Norway, which starts above the water and ends underwater. It's a transcendental building. You can look at the waterscape below. So it's not a restaurant per se, it's also a marine biological research center at the same time, simply through observation. The window that you have at the front of this building is there to observe what is happening outside the window. It's the latest barrier for people when it comes to the free and open ocean. So we, as humans, are in the aquarium, and the fish are swimming freely around. You can take this one step further to say, what if the tool of our architecture in the perception of these three that I've mentioned initially, the walking, the oblique, and the prepositions, can be turned into one step further, like designing a building that you can walk on? How do prepositions then work? What kind of activities can you expect when you don't lock it into the way you deal with your immediate surroundings? I think it's all about how you integrate art. It's all about how you create the surfaces that you're walking on. It's all about how you allow accessibility to many. It's all about the different perceptions of what movement could be like. This is Patrick's little girl. And it's, you know, this kind of understanding of, and we'll get back to that later, this kind of understanding of closeness to your immediate surrounding. Not necessarily based on any kind of metaphysical understanding of it, but back to realities, back to the exact point when something is happening directly in relationship with the building and its surroundings. That is what it does. It triggers, as in nature, the complete variation of use. So how do you break the rules? Do you break the rules by being at the outskirts of society and have the possibility of making your own decisions, or do you have to follow regulations? No, you don't. You can do illegal things that are better than the legal things that you could do. And I think it is important for us to understand this, because as we move under the Opera House, not only on top of it, there is the most magnificent artificial reef that generates now new life in the fjord of Oslo. And these things belong together. They are directly related. There is no upside and downside, no sideways, or to the left or to the right, like Raoul Bundschoten, famous Dutch architect, once says, the best place to be is with nothing to the right and nothing to the left. There's only up and down. It's the only condition you need to relate to. And similarly, now when we did the Center for the Lascaux cave paintings, 25,000-year-old cave paintings, and that puts us back into this dilemma of preservation of things that we believe are important. By walking into these caves today and just breathing, the color of the paintings would fall off the wall. So you have to create a replica of the caves for people to be able to visit at all. But this replica is not a precise replica, which is again the discussion on origin of the origin. It becomes the creation of a contemporary piece. It becomes the artists themselves. And of course, it again relates to how do you site-specifically relate the building back to this breaking point between agriculture, forest, and hill. So as you walk up, through, under, and into the caves, and then comes the art performance, together with the copy, replica of 25,000-year-old paintings. I've been trying to give you examples on this close to the skin experiences in relationship to surroundings, coming out of these three first: walking, the oblique, and of course, where is your body, and the preposition. And these come from picking from certain and different types of people around the world. It is not invented by us, but it's translated into architecture by us. Now, a little bit on solitude. You have to remember this comes from a person that during the COVID, like in Finland and Norway, they were saying we were all very frustrated about the 1 meter distance because we couldn't wait to get back to the at least 15 meter distance. But you have to see this as a way of, let's say, escape, right? Let's say you come from this environment and you grow up as someone who's opposing to find something in themselves that is different from this beautiful environment. You want something else. And the best way you can get it is, of course, to try to move forward and to try something else. You want to escape. You want to be in opposition to that particular society you are within, which you're part of. It's natural. From generation to generation, we say that if you don't oppose when you're young, you better do it when you get older. Because that contrast needs to be at some point in everybody's life. And when Wittgenstein became teacher, I think it was an escape. Because the setting that he was in was something that he could so easily describe and send away. That my school would have not looked the same if it was within the central Vienna. It needed the landscape, it needed a sky for him to pull out the writing in this particular picture in order to pinpoint something super important. And of course, he was already 32 years old. It's 1921. And he was in this village, kind of like alpine structure, you could say. He was sort of walking past doors and teaching kids. And it was so, in a way, simple. You can compare it to the breaking out of someone who wants to go and do something else. And these rooms are quite the opposite of what he had grown up in. He needed to bring it down somehow, is my assumption. It's the most crazy situation you can imagine, all the issues he went through here. And it didn't take that long, actually, that he really, to put it bluntly, couldn't stand it anymore. There was absolutely no way that he would stay here longer. Not because I think of the children, but because of that small city attitude and mentality. So the split situation of Wittgenstein, wanting something else, not liking it in the end for many reasons, and at the same time carrying with him his childhood experiences and not being able to break with it, which is going to be important when we move forward, because once he started looking at this kind of situation and being able to do something else again, teacher, now a wannabe architect. I think the Loshaus is, of course, and I won't talk much about it, you all know it, it's here, and you know all the theories of laws and how you work with it, but maybe it's important to say that the kind of connection that happened early stage with Los's ambition to wanting to be an architect was also with the more revolutionary thinking that was directly connected to this type of architecture. So, laws was, of course, very important. And there are so many things, the Steiner house, the Scheu house, the Müller house. But I particularly like these drawings, because I think, to some extent, here, for the first time, with sort of projecting the section of the house onto the facade, you understand the thinking of laws, and maybe also later the understanding of the actual Wittgenstein house. But this drawing, to me, is that this kind of way of creating source-related architectures that come from the interior to the exterior becomes super clear. I've never seen a drawing as clear based on the intention of what you want to achieve as these facades. And of course, I think to some extent, the Wittgenstein house as such. By the way, you know, I think Ollie went through a fantastic description of, I think they were quarreling a lot. I don't think he was a nice guy, you know, I really don't. I think he was treating whatever is happening here with the perfection of things that he wanted to achieve in maybe not the most sympathetic way. So we always have that question, what prevails? The understanding of the possible result you can achieve or how you treat people. And I really don't think that he could ever have lived in this house himself. I think it was a pure experiment, and he used and misused his sister to get there. Of course, all these things have a certain kind of drama to them in the way they're being perceived, down to the smallest element. We can go through designs of glass. We can, you know all of this. I don't have to say it. It's so amazingly unashamed type of architecture. You know all about the story when he had to lift the ceiling and you know he was unhappy with everything. But in the end, it portrays a certain attitude that, again, with all this almost reductionist ways of thinking and spending years on radiators and handles and what have you, how crazy can you get? I understand that he had to get away. At Cambridge, you have to remember, full of academics, he didn't want that anymore. He was concerned about how reality could be perceived through the language and how that was translated back. So no question that he would build himself a little house in solitude. Now here comes the thing. It's not really solitude. This is quite close to all of the things that are surrounding the small villages surrounding. It's not real solitude. So again, this double-edged sword where he claims one thing and then he knows he can always meet people. Although he stayed in this fantastic setting for quite some time altogether and wrote a lot and maybe had the feeling of solitude. But when he left the academic life in Cambridge, and he ended up in Norway and created Little Austria, there are so many ways you could look at how this actually was created. He wasn't there when they built it most of the time. He had information coming through letters. The postmaster in Scholten was actually the guy writing to him and saying, now it's progressing, no, it's not progressing, now it's moving forward, now it's not. And he wrote back, and he sent payments to the construction workers through a third person who did not know that she was going to receive the money to pay the workers. She just received a bunch of money, and they assumed it was for the workers. Why is it Little Austria? Why is he holding on to this Austrian way of thinking when he's building it in Scholten? And why did he go to Scholten at all? There are lots of beautiful places very similar to this. We don't quite know, but we do know that when he designed his house, he designed it with the gable towards the water. Quite contrary to how a Norwegian house would have been located in this position, where you would have had the gable, what's it called in English again? Let's say the ridge. The ridge of the roof would be parallel to the landscape, because you would be able to enter from two sides when the snow came, so you didn't want the snow to fall onto your side. You wanted big portions of it to fall down the hill. Not like the alpine structures that we know from Austria, northern Italy, and so forth. And the location of the balcony is not Norwegian at all. There's nothing Norwegian about this house in any ways. It is holding back to the memory of almost like paying back what he experienced when he was a teacher. It's like creating his own piece of architecture. We don't even know if it was ever drawn or just built, or maybe there was just an outline of how big it should be and where the stairs should be. So in any case, he had this building built, called it Little Austria, and there is probably something in relationship to how it's oriented towards landscape and the perception of the landscape. So not being in solitude, at least it had to be difficult to reach, either by boat or by the way you actually generate the transport of things, food, to this particular place. You had to carry it either for a certain period of time walking, or you had to do it, as I said, by boat. There was a long line going down to the fjord where you could pull it up and have it into his home. But most importantly, I think, the level of the lake is higher than the sea, and there is another lake slightly lower. And all of a sudden, you have two horizons from this particular point of view. Because you have two levels of water that create a horizontal plane, and we all know that the confusion is being created by the fact that the horizon is no longer where your eyes are. The horizon is described by the horizontal surfaces that are absolute horizontal, the water. So maybe that's an issue related directly to the location of this place, that you actually had two water surfaces after each other that you could see, and maybe that view was important because the sketchiness of his writing and the possible interpretations in the ways you could go needed two separate horizons. And of course, the interiors are nothing like here. They're more similar to the school building. They're not even like the spaces he lived at in Cambridge. But there is this super simplicity. And I have to say, this is a reconstructed building, right? Because after he left, the local community took the building apart and used every piece and bit of Wittgenstein's house for their own houses. They moved it away and put it into, adding on to their living room, adding on to their bedroom. So it took like 14 years to gather all these pieces back in and adding new pieces to make it happen. Now it's protected. Nobody is allowed to live there, which I find a shame. And of course, it is as close to the situation that you have, or as close as possible to the situation that you had when he was there. So I think, again, this reductionist, which he claims it's not, reductionist move towards these materials that you find here with the local provision is maybe coming from somewhere else than, of course, when he was so preoccupied with the precision of the House Wittgenstein. Here, everything is about tolerance in construction. Here, nothing is precise. Here, everything feigns in one way or the other. And of course, that gives him satisfaction. I can't imagine that I would have worked anywhere as I do here. It's the quiet and perhaps the wonderful scenery. I mean, it's quite seriousness. And to me, again, this has a double edge. In a way, he still portrays it as quiet, but it's not really that quiet. It's not like on the North Pole. It is still very much connected to his mixing with the local community. I think he's portraying something here that maybe has a slightly different notion of heroic romanticism. Maybe there is a touch that this particular position that you want to take is important. And I think Arne Næss, Norwegian eco-philosopher could have said exactly the same thing with the same romantic kind of approach to it, but maybe with the understanding of solitude as something that is even more precise in the way of defining it. So Anna Næss really, it took about 4 hours to walk to this cabin, right? And it was the harshest kind of location. However, Anna Næss clearly says that he was inspired by Wittgenstein's solitude definition. So in a way, retracting yourself, the same thing could be said about Heidegger, for instance. I mean, as you put yourself in a position where you don't see people for weeks, at that particular point in time, people are saying, ooh, is it loneliness or is it solitude? And if it is loneliness, then it's chosen. It's a choice made out of free will. And I think, to some extent, this particular choice also indicates what you write at that particular point in time. Anna Næss was clear about it, Wittgenstein not so clear. But Anna Næss says, unless I can walk out from this cabin in my clown suit all alone, I cannot write about nature. He needed this long-term understanding for him to be able to write what he wanted to write. He said, if an angel came through my window one night, I would first of all think it's someone who's been walking 4 hours to play me a joke. Then I would check out how the wings were connected to the body. And after 20 minutes, I would believe in angels, eternal life, and I would join in. Now you have to see this in context to how you formulate yourself with an open end. Maybe only nature has that in it. Not even urban settings where you meet lots of people. Maybe only nature has that in it, that it's completely open-ended. We have, similarly, over a long period of time, been debating exactly this kind of accessibility in landscapes. And we've created a series of projects that we call keyless structures. That means buildings that cannot be closed. They are open for you to go and search. They're more artificial in their collective or individual solitude situation, but they give you a similar notion of how you should perceive that particular situation you're in. One of them is called the Wild Reindeer Pavilion by the foot of the mountain Snøhetta. It's this kind of retreat that allows you to come and sit and again be captured in this place to go to. You can spend the day, some people spend the night, and we were extremely fascinated by the idea of being able to reproduce exactly the same shape, but it would never look the same because of the wood. So you could repeat this shape, this kind of organic thing, endlessly by the computer, carving it out, but because of the wood, it would never ever look the same. So again, whatever we try to capture in a logic sense of repetition and the original portion of it will not help us when we deal with nature and natural materials. That maintains itself in its uniqueness and in the way we experience it. And again, similar to under, this is the breaking point between people and nature. So behind this point, nature is on its own. And that's coming from Anna Næss's way of looking at it. You can't even walk behind this area. So, this protection that we have can be taken one step further. It can be taken into situations in the Norwegian mountains where you think that the keyless structures have no meaning, but they do, because you never know who will need them. You're out walking. First a bit about the construction. We pick the wood. We learn people how to carve with the axe. You go back in history. You relate it to the surfaces and how wood is being treated. But maybe more importantly, the location of this building is then the last protection you have. This outer skin that allows you to get inside with your friends. There's a bit of food, there's a bit of firewood, and you just walk in. Nobody controls you. And if you feel like it, you can leave a little portion of money. So in the end, how do we relate to these circumstances that we, as human beings, especially in the Western world, spend about 90% of our life indoor and about 14% bathroom toilets? How do you deal with this little issue when you read and get inspired by the people that have gone before you, and how you need to take it in? Of course, solitude is many things. It's the solitude of building as a protagonist, as much as it is the solitude of a person looking for that solitude. And in the end, that leads us back to the Wittgenstein cabin in Skjolden, because that's a lonely building. And that building, without going into too deep on let's say, metaphysical elements, but there is an element of the representation of that reality also in objects. And that's what led us. How much time do I still have? I don't need so much, actually. We can discuss more afterwards. But that's what led me and us. Huh?
15 minutes.
Yeah, perfect. 15 minutes is like eternity now. This led us to the project of the Perspektivenweg in Innsbruck, Snøhetta. And we made 10 kind of locations in the landscape for people to understand how they relate particularly to that landscape, but also how they're being pushed by certain texts to actually help you to see. So at the very first, when you enter, Alan Jannik helped us out to find texts from different Wittgenstein texts. This one is from Philosophische Untersuchungen. Do I really see something different every time I look, or do I only interpret what I see in different ways? I'm inclined to say the first, but why? Interpreting is a form of thinking and activity. Seeing is a state of mind. I think nothing can be closer to the truth when it comes to architecture. So we made a series of elements. The first one was this information element, which only has a text. The second one is a platform saying things are right before your eyes. It's a direct Wittgenstein text. The element number 3 is a bench. Certain aspects of seeing appear puzzling to us because to us the whole matter of seeing does not seem puzzling enough. Which actually means you have to sit down and think about this sentence, right? So it fits this bench massively. You have the penetration, the stair. You have is being struck, looking and thinking? No. Because you can't get struck by something that you haven't already interpreted. Now, there's an element called the big stone. The concept of seeing makes a tangled impression. Now, that's the way it is. I look into the landscape, my glance wanders. I see all sorts of clear and unclear movement. This leaves its mark on me clearly. That only fully blurred. Again, the double-sided thing. What we can see seem to be completely torn into bits. Element number 6, the yin and yang bench. Don't let yourself be led by the example of other people, but by nature. And here you have a revolutionary sentence that directly connects to a reference that Anne Næss did much later. The lene, or the leaning kind of structure. Don't think, look. And another bench, thoughts rise slowly to the surface like bubbles. Again, this complete translation of when you go internal and when you go external. Another bench, let nature speak. Same message. And finally, the auditorium. Ask yourself, how do people get an eye for something? And how can this eye be used? That's what we've been trying to do. Thank you so much.